Hi, I'm Hussein and welcome to my YouTube channel. Maybe one of the darkest chapters of our living memory is what happened in Syria. Although Syrians have faced many unbelievable challenges, more importantly, they have never had a voice to defend their right. You've always heard news about Syria from mainstream media. Little did you know, these big companies were pursuing their interest in Syrian bloody war. After a decade, we certainly can say which sides lied and which sides said the truth. This video wants to expose the lies you've heard for 10 years. So, let's get started. After the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq and the destruction of Libya, Syria was to be the next state overthrown. Washington and its regional allies had planned this for some time. After regime change in Damascus, Hezbollah would be isolated. Iran would be left alone. After Iran, Washington would control the entire region, excluding possible competitors such as Russia and China. The US and its close regional collaborators, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Turkey, Qatar, and Jordan, have used the worst of reactionary and sectarian forces to pursue their ends. To understand what happened in Syria, we must go back before 2011. Although the Bush administration imposed a series of sanctions on Syria between 2003 and 2008, supposedly linked to its role in Lebanon and Iraq, there were also high levels of diplomatic contacts with the Syrian government. In early 2006, groundwork was being laid for intervention. The US State Department had allocated $5 million for Syrian governance and reform programs. The Bush administration was funding media channels and NGOs. US State Department had funded televisions and a network of Syrian exiles called the Movement for Justice and Development. Often US policy seemed incoherent, but hostility was not far below the surface. The US demanded liberalization of Syrian economic policy, but blocked its attempt to join the World Trade Organization. The entire policy of the United States was that this Syrian regime has to go, whether with infiltration or invasion. That ambition included military preparation, but not just conventional military. The British were on board 2 years before the violence erupted in Syria. This is not my word, this is former Secretary of France's word.
Je me trouvais en Angleterre par hasard pour d'autres choses, pas du tout de la Syrie. J'ai rencontré des responsables anglais et quelques-uns qui sont mes amis m'ont avoué, en me sollicitant, qu'ils se préparaient quelque chose en Syrie. C'était en Angleterre et pas en Amérique. L'Angleterre préparait l'invasion des rebelles en Syrie. Et on m'a même demandé à moi, sous le prétexte que j'étais ancien ministre des Affaires étrangères, si je participerais comme ça. J'ai évidemment dit le contraire, j'ai dit écoutez, moi je suis français, ça ne m'intéresse pas. Mais c'est pour dire que cette opération vient de très loin. Elle a été préparée, conçue, organisée.
Dans quel but Excusez-moi, dans quel but? L'idée de renverser Bachar, c'était quoi le but?
Dire, la finalité? Mais dans le but très simple, de destituer le gouvernement syrien, parce que dans la région, il est important de savoir que ce régime syrien a des propos anti-israéliens. Et que par conséquent, tout ce qui bouge dans la région autour, moi j'ai la confidence du Premier ministre israélien qui remonte très longtemps, qui m'avait dit on essaiera de s'entendre avec le Premier ministre, avec les États autour. Et ceux qui ne s'entendront pas, on les abattra. C'est une politique, c'est une conception de l'histoire Pourquoi pas, après tout? Mais il faut le savoir.
Frédéric Elbé.
With the Arab Spring of 2011, the big powers took advantage of political turmoil by imposing an extremist movement attacking the few remaining independent states of the region. Very quickly, we saw the destruction of Libya, a small country with the highest standards of living in Africa. 2 days before NATO bombed Libya, another armed Islamist insurrection broke out in Daraa, Syria's southernmost city. Yet because this insurrection was linked to the demonstration of political reform movement, its nature was discussed. Many did not see that those who were providing the guns, Qatar and Saudi Arabia, were also running fake news stories in their media channels. According to consistent Western media report, the Syrian army did nothing but kill civilians for years. To this day, many imagine the Syrian conflict is a civil war, a popular revolt, or some sort of internal sectarian conflict. These myths are in many respects a substantial achievement for the big powers which have driven a series of regime change operations in Middle East region, all on false pretext. I would go so far as to say that in waging war on Syria, people in general abandon their logic system of reason, the maintenance of ethical principle and the search for independent evidence at times of conflict. That weakness was reinforced by a ferocious campaign of war propaganda. Very few sensible perspectives on Syria emerged after 2011 as critical voices were effectively blocked. The claim that armed opposition to the government has only begun a year after protests is a complete lie. The killing of soldiers, police and civilians, often in the most brutal circumstances, have been going on since the beginning. Among different groups held peaceful protests in 2011, only one section of that opposition, the Muslim Brotherhood and other Salafists, was linked to the violence that erupted in Daraa. Large anti-government demonstrations began to be met with huge pro-government demonstration. In early March, some teenagers in Daraa were arrested for graffiti that had been copied, some slogans from North Africa. It was reported that they were abused by local police. To cool down the situation, Syrian president intervened. The local governor was sacked and the teenagers were released. In Syria, the big powers have sought to hide their hands, using proxy armies, while demonizing both Syrian government and Syrian army, accusing them of constant atrocities, then pretending to rescue the Syrian people from their own government. Far fewer people opposed the war on Syria than opposed the invasion of Iraq, because they were deceived about its true nature. Yet the Islamic insurrection was underway, taking cover under the street demonstrations. In March, several days before the violence broke out in Daraa, there were reports that Syrian forces had seized a large shipment of weapons and explosives and night vision goggles in a truck coming from Iraq. The truck was stopped at border close to Jordan. Weapons were intended for use in actions that affect Syria's internal security and spread unrest and chaos. Pictures showed dozens of grenades and pistols as well as rifles and ammunition belts. The driver said the weapons had been loaded in Baghdad and he had been paid $5,000 to deliver them to Syria. Despite this interception, armed did reach Daraa, a border town of about 150,000 people. This is where the moderate rebel and the independent stories diverge, and diverge dramatically. Here is a sort of everything we must know, because that's a moment everyone flashbacks to a state cruelty of Syrian regime. The Western media consensus was that security forces opened fire on protesters, killing as many people as possible. The Syrian government, on the other hand, said there were unprovoked attacks on security forces, killing police and civilians, along with the burning of government offices. Daily Mail showed pictures of guns, rifles, and hand grenades that security forces had recovered after storming a mosque. The paper noted reports that an armed gang had opened fire on an ambulance, killing a doctor, few civilians, soldiers, and policemen. People of the neighborhood observed that 7 policemen were killed during clashes between the security forces and protesters in Syria, while other news reports said 7 police officers and at least 4 demonstrators in Syria have been killed, and the Syrian party headquarters and courthouse were torched. These police had been targeted by rooftop snipers. Did any news agencies cover other side of the story? No. The only thing you know is Syrian government kills and only kills. The violence spread north with the assistance of Islamist fighters from Lebanon. In April, 9 soldiers were shot in a bus ambush. A general was killed with his 2 sons and a nephew. A Syrian commander was gunned down near his home. 2 days later, a colonel was killed in his car. These were not the only deaths, but they proved most Western media channels maintain the fiction to this day that there was no Islamist insurrection and the peaceful protest did not pick up arms until September 2011. In fact, for 2 main reasons we have a dubious picture of the first stages of war. 1. Syrian government did not want to confess. It is unable to control the situation. It is losing war with heavy casualties. And 2. Moderate rebel did not want to say that they are armed head to toe with foreign help. Several reports, including video reports, observed rooftop snipers firing at crowds and police during funerals of those already killed. It was said to be unclear who was firing at whom, as an unknown armed group on rooftops shot at protesters and security forces. The armed forces came to Daraa precisely because police had been shot and killed. But who was behind these armed groups that you've never heard of, and why they did so much cruelty to innocents in climax of rightful protests of Syrians? Saudi Arabia, a key US regional ally, had armed and funded extremist Salafist Sunni sect to move against the secular government. Saudi officials later confirmed to news that his country had sent arms to Syria. From exile in Saudi Arabia, Salafi Sheikh called for a holy war against the liberal Alawi Muslims who were set to dominate the Syrian government. By Allah, we shall mince the Alawis in meat grinders and feed their flesh to the dogs. If people of Syria want change according to what we heard for 10 years, why did they curse each other? The genocidal slogan Christian to Beirut, Alawis to the grave became widespread. If people of Syria want to have a better government, why do they kill each other? Because a very small group of protesters who were hiding behind people aim was a caliphate, not to make Syria great again. Let's take a moment to dig more in the roots of these groups. Although Al-Qaeda in Iraq, also known as ISIS, at first claimed to be overwhelmingly Iraqi, Saudi finance and recruiting significantly internationalized it. Based on Sinjar record, half of the group were Saudis. The Saudi strategy was to provoke sectarian conflict among Shia and Sunni in Iraq, and it is extremely important to know Al-Qaeda emergence has never been an organic reaction to the US occupation. Western sources sometimes acknowledge that much of the finance and the fighters of Al-Qaeda have come from Saudi Arabia. only for one purpose: destruction of Iraq. Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates are spreading Wahhabism, while Qatar and Turkey are supporters of Muslim Brotherhood. If you are not familiar with these ideology terms, you can fully understand their outcomes in Iraq and Syria and Yemen. In case of Syria, both of these groups, under the leadership of United States, came to one conclusion: destruction of Syria through sectarian war. Saudis and Qataris cooperate with each other, but they also have important elements of competition. For example, at the start of the insurrection in Syria, the tiny petro-monarchy of Qatar began as the financer of Muslim Brotherhood, linked Islamists of the Free Syrian Army. Meanwhile, Saudis prefer to back a range of disparate and dependent internationalized Salafi groups at some distance from the Muslim Brotherhood, like the Al-Qaeda group and An-Nusra. Other smaller groups have proliferated in the search for money and arms from foreign sponsors. When the Arab Spring erupted in Tunisia, then Egypt and Libya, Salafi groups and the Muslim Brotherhoods became the beneficiaries of these changes. Syria saw yet another version under political reform protests. The extreme Takfiri ideas, where those of other faith can be attacked and killed, these ideas were encouraged by the Saudi Wahhabi, seem to have become well embedded in most of the armed groups in Syria. Despite some reshuffles within a very short time, the leadership of both the exiled political leadership of the revolution were firmly in the hands of Salafi groups, dominated by Brotherhood. In another word, for media fabrication they have put the picture of Justin Trudeau on the surface and inherent of Osama bin Laden on the ground. This moderate image was perhaps wishful thinking. Most of the Al-Faruq battalion's members were Salafist, armed and funded by Saudi Arabia, while Khalid ibn Walid battalion is loyal and supported by Muslim Brotherhood, armed and funded by Qatar. Early in the conflict, the Faruq battalion chanting Christian to Beirut, Alavis to the grave. The Christian Orthodox Church then accused Faruq of the large-scale ethnic cleansing. When the Qatari and Saudi monarchy, which have invested billions of dollars in the armed attacks in Syria, present an anonymous picture of a witness or evidence in their rosy channel, we must all know they are worried about their investment in Syria, not what is happening in there. The opposition-controlled areas are in the hands of terrorist organizations responsible for multiple atrocities in Syria. One of these groups' commander, infamously shown on a video trying to eat a dead Syrian soldier's heart. Another group is believed responsible for the use of a child to behead prisoners. These are hardly moderate rebels that gained international support. There were a number of other Salafi jihadi groups in the early months. It is notable that none of the secular theory seems able to name any particular groups. In early stages of conflict, it was admitted that nowhere in rebel-controlled Syria is there a secular fighting force to speak of. A distinct feature of Syrian conflict has been the very large-scale participation of foreign Salafi jihadists, particularly from 2012 onward, from a range of countries including Saudi Arabia, Libya, Tunisia, Yemen, Iraq, Chechnya. This factor emphasized the fact that the conflict was not simply a civil war. The Salafi and Brotherhood forces were able to prolong their attacks because of the participation of thousands of outside fighters, most of them paid by Qatar and Saudi Arabia and trained in Jordan and Turkey. Indeed, the Syrian Islamists had been effectively defeated by early 2012, but they were reinforced by many thousands of foreign jihadists, most of them passing through Turkey. The US, Britain and France at first led a diplomatic offensive, attempting to isolate the Syrian government and to impose successive non-elected exile groups as the legitimate representative of the Syrian people. Nevertheless, along with regional collaborators, particularly Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, they funded and armed all the various armed groups. Turkey provided training grounds and a staging post for attacks on northern Syria. Qatar funded the Brotherhood and provided arms through Turkey, recruiting foreign fighters. Qatari Broadcasting Agency denied atrocities from their backed group, as also the reinforcement provided by armed foreigners. Former Al Jazeera journalist Ali Hashem was one of many who resigned from the Qatari-owned station, complaining of deep bias over their presentation of the violence in Syria. Hashem had footage of armed men arriving from Lebanon, but this was censored by his Qatari managers. War propaganda often demands the abandoning of ordinary reasons and principle, and the dirty war on Syria demonstrates this in abundance. A steady stream of atrocity stories, barrel bombs, chemical weapons, industrial-scale killings, dead babies, permeates the Western news on Syria. When tracked back, all the stories come from utterly partisan sources. We are being deceived. First, they said the conflict began because the Syrian army killed unarmed protesters, and opposition supporters eventually began to take up arms, first to defend themselves and later to expel security forces from the local areas. Then they said we as big powers must help Syrian people from Syrian regime by giving them weapons. Now we all know to who were those weapons given. Moderate rebel, in another word, terrorists. While it is important to recognize the source of bias, the reputation of anti-Syrian stories based on partisan sources cannot be a matter of simple bias. We know from independent evidence that earlier claims of massacres were fabricated by the sectarian groups, then backed by Washington. After these exposures, there were no apologies or admission either from the Western media channels which ran the initial stories or governments. We should also recognize there is an industrial-scale propaganda machine likely to maintain production into the foreseeable future. After 10 years of lies, we still see big Western media generate history for other nations, especially Syria, which incidence varies dramatically with outside Syria's border. Yet Syrians are recovering from what others did to their country. They have remained voiceless. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed. If you want to say anything, please comment down below. In the next video, I will talk about what is happening in Iraq. So, until next time, bye.